So this is going to be pretty short. I just want to go over the annotated bibliography stuff. Essentially, annotated bibliographies are just a dog's one, are just summaries of sources. There's a couple slightly technical elements. None of it's really complicated to go into, just to make sure that we cover all of the little details. So to do that, I'm going to look at an example real quick that I found online that I usually use. So I like this one because it kind of has some of this labeled. So your bibs are going to be a little bit longer than this. I have another example I'm going to send out to everybody from a previous student that'll be a little bit better of an idea of the length of them. But this is a general idea. You're going to start off with the your citation up here. If you're an MLA or APA, MLA is if you're in the humanities, APA is if you're in the sciences. You'll notice you have a hanging indent here. I want to show you guys how to do that here in a moment. So this is kind of a weird indentation where the top line of the citation is justified in the furthest leftmost margin. And then after that, it is indented. And then you see that the entry itself also has this kind of weird margin. This is really important. This is how all of these always go. Anytime you do an annotated bibliography, they have to have this set up. So make sure yours has that. And again, I'm going to go over that in a bit, how to set all that up. So you have your citation up here. If you aren't super comfortable with your citation, a lot of the sources, the database and stuff you guys have been working with should have a citation generator. Don't use a citation generator website. They're crap. But a lot of like the hosting services will have a citation. Just make sure you're picking the right one. For instance, if you go to like MLA, if you choose, generation option, there'll be like MLA 5, 6, 7, 8. Do the most recent, the highest number you can find on the edition. Use that one. You want to use the most recent edition. They're constantly changing the citation rules and stuff like that. It's really frustrating. So make sure you choose the right one. Anyway. So after you do your citation, you skip a line. You'll see this is single spaced, and you just give a summary. And you're going to be dealing with sources that are pretty long. It can be difficult sometimes if you have, a 20-page source to condense it down to a single paragraph. It's important to understand that you don't need to get into any details. This is like really broad stroke level summarization where you're literally just hitting the high points. It's totally sufficient just to say they talked about this. Like, let's say you're looking at something and they're making some kind of argument. You don't necessarily, depending on how that argument is featuring, let's say there's a section of your source that has an argument in it, and there's a lot of other stuff going on in the source. There's like 3 or 4 sections, and only one of those sections is this argument. You could just say they presented an argument for this, and you don't have to get into all of the details of the argument, all the premises and the conclusion and all of that. You don't have to get into all the details. It's totally sufficient to say this was spoken about, and then give maybe one kind of defining detail. And again, you'll have examples to look at these and kind of see what this looks like in practice. So let's look at this one. This volume grew out of the 5th annual conference of Ukraine on Ukrainians in Canada that was held at the University of Manitoba. I assume I'm saying that right. In 1981, it offers an exhaustive exploration of Ukrainian Canadian arts. Right, that's great. It's a great summary. That's like the as broad as it can go. It's really what you want, especially that first or second sentence is kind of try to, in one sentence, what is this whole thing about? And then break it down into parts. What did part 1 do? Part 2, part 3. You don't want to spend more than a sentence per part, per section, right? Definitely, if there's 2 sections, then maybe 3 or 4 sentences. But if there's 4, 5, 6 sections, then 1 sentence is totally sufficient. Don't overthink this. You're supposed to be broad. Don't feel like you're leaving something out. As long as you're hitting those high points. The idea, I guess I should discuss what the purpose of the annotated bibs are in the professional world. bibliographies are ways that researchers help future researchers. What that means is, let's say that you are reading a study, and you hit one section of study that's really interesting, and in particular you see them mention one source, and they only just kind of touch on that source, and you're like, oh, that was a really interesting statistic. I want to look into that. That would be really relevant to what I'm trying to do with my whole project. So you go in, and if they have an annotated bibliography, they're essentially doing the reading for you. They're saying, this is what all of this is about, because ultimately a research paper is going to be taking things out of context. There's no way you can talk about the fullness of another source in your own. By nature, you're pulling things and recontextualizing them in your own work. And so what it's essentially doing, it's paying an homage to that source and saying, this is what it's all about. I couldn't get to all of it, but this is what all of this source was about. And that helps potential researchers, so they can say, okay, well, when you presented it in the context you used it, it seemed like it was about this, but now that I've read your summary of it, I realize it's about something else and it's not as useful for me. And so keep that in mind, that these summaries are meant to help other researchers. It's not like a reading quiz where I'm going to read these to see if you really read every line or something like that. It's very much a practical tool in the field that helps other people, and by extension helps you whenever you read annotated bibliographies. And so be thinking about that. Be thinking about, how can I, as quickly as possible, cover this whole source in a way that gives a reader, another potential researcher, everything they need to know. That's what's really important, is don't leave anything out that would be important for them to know about this source, which means talking about what's going on in those whole sections, right? But they don't really need to know the details. If they are in a position as they're reading it to want to know the details, they just read the source, right? That's the whole idea, is this is supposed to be just a really quick, give me 30 seconds of reading to make a decision of whether or not this is useful for me. If I decide it's useful, then I'll go get the details myself. So I know it's a long walk for a short drink of water, but that's the idea here. And I know a lot of you might overthink it and feel like when you get done with your summaries, I know I always did, I always felt like I was leaving something out. I felt like I was leaving a lot out, but that's the entire point. This is just broad stroke stuff. So they say the first part examines Ukrainian Canadian material culture. Part 2 looks at aspects of ethnicity in Ukrainian Canadian visual arts. And part 3 analyzes the different styles of Ukrainian Canadian music. That's one sentence. I know there's some semicolons there, but essentially one sentence covering 3 sections. Right, so you can see the broad strokes. Now this is really short. This is an extremely short entry. The last thing I want to talk about is this last part. So you do what's called a qualitative review. After you've summarized the content of the source, you also need to talk about the quality of the source, which usually means talking about its readability, which means, like, is it jargon heavy? Is it easy or difficult to read? And then a small kind of discussion why. And by discussion, I just mean like a half sentence where you just essentially say, it was somewhat hard to read due to its highly technical language. For someone, a professional in the field, this will not be a problem, but layman audiences might struggle, right? And so you're just kind of letting them know, that way the potential researcher knows, like, oh, I'm just a college freshman, that's going to be too technical for me, or oh, I'm a PhD, that's exactly what I'm looking for, right? You also discuss the relevance of the source to the project of the research, right? So you also want to give an idea of how was this relevant to what you were doing, because it might not be immediately obvious to the reader. So in this case, this author might be looking at, here's their research topic: Ukrainian Canadian literature and multiculturalism in Canada. And then their discussion of the relevance, they say, this book, however, does not discuss Ukrainian Canadian literary arts, provides an excellent foundation discussion of literature by exploring other arts or literary art. So they're not talking, so it was relevant because they talk about other arts, but it wasn't super relevant because it wasn't talking about literature, which that's what their essay was about, right? And so you can see, like, it's essentially a defense. It's saying, this is why I used it. It was relevant to me in this specific way. So in our example of, the topic of the plastic eating algae, let's say there's a source, and I'm looking at various kinds of algae, and there's no discussion of the specific species of plastic eating algae, right? I would say, even though this doesn't go into a deep discussion of the algae that this paper is specifically about, it gives a great idea of the various species of algae, which was necessary to talk about some of the elements of the specific algae that I'm writing about, like their biology and stuff like that. So that's all you're doing. So you're going to, at the end, after your summary, you give a qualitative review, which just says essentially how readable was it and why so, and then its relevancy to your project. So this is the example I'm going to send out. This was a really great student I had last semester, Victoria Nichols. She's given the okay for us to look at her work throughout the semester. We looked at her grant proposal. Now we're going to look at our annotated bibliography. So she goes slightly over and beyond. These are almost full page bib entries. These are really great, though. If I were to change one thing, her review is a little long. So you don't necessarily have to be this long. I would like to see the summaries be just a touch longer, but ultimately these are great. I have no problem with these. That's just me being nitpicky, as I always am with good students. Right. So I'm going to send this out to everybody. I'm about to email out. I'm going to upload this to YouTube, send you guys the link, send you guys this as a PDF. This should be everything that you need. Now, I want to go over this hanging indent here. So to do this, you can see this already has a hanging indent, but just to go ahead and show you, what you do is you go to, you highlight all of it, and then you go to Format, Align and Indent, and then indentation options, because you'll see that there's no option for a hanging indent here. It's called a special indent in this processor. So indentation options. And then you can see special indent here. Usually it says none, but you go to hanging indent. The 0.5 is fine, which should be what auto generates, and then apply, and it'll scooch it all over. And then let's see, the way that you can change this is go here, and then you go to this ruler and you line it up with this. It's the second line. Bam, there you go. That's all you got to do. Right, so Victoria had to do this. I didn't really push this last semester, but I figure while I'm here, I might as well show you guys how to do this. So again, you just highlight all of this, and then you go to your ruler up here. It's this first one. This is the indentation bar. This is where your margin is, and you just move that over. And you wouldn't need those. You wouldn't need the indentation. All right. So I think that's about it. That's all I have to show you. Again, don't overthink this stuff. Focus on your annotations. It's really, if you annotated your text, you should have to read everything. You should be able to go through and just kind of look at those high points that you've marked. And again, we're just looking at like section level, like it talked about this, and then it talked about this, and then it talked about this, right? It's not even like back of the book blurb level detail. This is pretty broad. And then maybe a sentence, if say it talked about this, and then kind of give an idea of the discussion, like here, let's see. It's always a good idea to start off with like the purpose of the whole thing. This is what the author was trying to do. And then they also propose a circuit, a quantum computer. Oh, I see. That read really weird to my brain. They also propose a circuit a quantum computer could use to implement it. They accomplish these things by first setting up explanations of the method their algorithm is supposed to be better than Shor's algorithm, of the method for something related that their algorithm is based off Zalka's algorithm, and with the accuracy and efficiency of Shor's is. That reads really grammatically odd. I'm sure it's correct though. But you can see, so they're setting this up and then giving really broad ideas of, and to talk about that, they talked about this. And they talked about this as was relevant to this, right? In no way does she need to define what Shor's algorithm is, Zalka's, or any of that, right? And this is how you'll get some length here. If you get through it and you have like 2 sentences and you've talked about the whole thing, then go for sentence 1, break down elements of it, and then discuss, like, they talk about this and they talked about it this way. You're shooting for between a half page and quarter page. 1 full page for the whole thing, citation included, is solid. That's, you really don't want to go over a page, even if you have a really long source. Again, this is about helping your fellow researchers and just giving them what they need. And remember, if they're interested enough in the source and what's going on in the broad sense, they'll go for the details themselves. They don't need it from you. That's not your job. All right, this is running, I think, officially long, so I'm going to wrap it up here. If you have any questions, email me. This is due on Monday, to have these summaries done. So again, it's summarize and then give a qualitative review, which just means tell me how readable it was and kind of defend that position. If you say it wasn't very readable, tell me why. If it was readable, tell me why. And then tell me the relevancy to your project in just 1 sentence. You can do 1 sentence. It's usually 2 sentences at the end. 1 sentence is for the readability, 1 sentence for the relevance. Everything else is just summary. All right. Stop that. Again, if you have any questions, email me. This is due Monday. Yeah. Have fun with it.